behind the gleaming facades of luxury, where every surface reflects power and every silence conceals pain, a young black man confronts a world built to exclude him. In this gilded cage, control is wielded like armor, grief is a weapon, and a child's silence hides a storm no one dares face. The truth lurking beneath polished surfaces will shatter everything they thought they knew, because sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not in the streets, but in the hearts trapped behind closed doors. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a reckoning with the invisible chains of loss, prejudice, and unexpected hope. If you're ready to unravel the secrets no one wants to speak aloud, like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Your voice matters, especially when the world tries to silence the unheard. Derek had grown up in a small apartment that always seemed too cramped for 3 people. The kind of place where you could hear every argument from the neighbors and every siren from a street. His mother, Gloria, was the kind of woman who could hold the whole household together with little more than grit and an unshakable will. Her voice always warm even when she was dead tired. She'd worked herself to the bone to make sure Derek and his younger sister Naomi had the chance to aim higher than the block they grew up on. But the day she collapsed in the kitchen, hands still wet from washing dishes, was the day everything changed. The doctors said it was an aneurysm, quick and unstoppable. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, and in that empty space, all the light seemed to drain from the apartment. Derek was 21 then, with 1 semester left in his graphic design program, and dreams of one day opening his own studio. But reality didn't care about dreams. His father, Harold, had been slowing down for years, the physical toll of decades of construction work wearing him down. The constant cough, the stiff movements, the appointments at the clinic, they all meant one thing. Harold couldn't pick up the slack his wife had left behind. Bills still came, the rent was still due, and Naomi still needed food on the table and a shot at college. Dropping out of school wasn't a choice Derek wanted to make, but it was the only one that made sense. His days blurred into a relentless grind. From sunrise until mid-afternoon, he was at the warehouse, hauling boxes and unloading trucks until his back screamed. At night, he put on a black shirt and worked as a busboy at a noisy downtown bar where drunk businessmen barked for more whiskey and tips barely made up for the abuse. He'd get home past midnight, too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to think about anything beyond the next day's shift. The apartment felt different without Gloria's presence. Harold sat in his chair in the living room, a blanket over his knees, watching old movies with the sound low. Naomi kept to her room, sketching designs in her notebook, headphones on, pretending not to notice when Derek skipped dinner to save food for them. Winter in Brooklyn was never kind, but that year it seemed especially cruel. The icy wind cut through Derek's cheap jacket, and the walk to the subway became another daily punishment. The heat in the building barely worked, and the pipes rattled all night like bones knocking together. Still, Derek pushed forward because stopping was an option. One evening, after a double shift at the warehouse and bar, Derek trudged up the narrow stairs to their floor and found Mr. Thompson, the elderly man across the hall, leaning on his cane and waiting outside Derek's apartment. "Evening sun," Mr. Thompson said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You look like hell. I might have something for you." He explained that his niece worked for a wealthy family in the Upper West Side, the Blakes, who were looking for a live-in butler to keep the household in order and help with their young daughter. It was a world away from anything Derek had ever done, but the offer was tempting. Steady pay, no rent, meals included. Derek tried to laugh it off. Him, a butler? He didn't know which fork was for salad or how to serve wine. But that night, lying in bed listening to the hum of the old radiator, he couldn't shake the thought. The rent money he'd save alone could go straight to Naomi's college fund. The next morning, he dug out his only suit, a thrift store find that didn't quite fit, and pressed it as best he could. The card Mr. Thompson had given him led to a building with a marble-floored lobby, gold accents, and a doorman who gave Derek a slow once-over before wordlessly pressing the elevator button for the top floor. When the doors opened, Derek stepped into a hallway lined with ornate mirrors and heavy oak doors. He knocked on the one marked PH1, and a moment later it swung open to reveal a tall man in his 70s with neatly combed white hair and a suit that probably cost more than Derek's entire wardrobe. "You must be Derek," the man said, offering a firm handshake. "I'm Lawrence Blake." The penthouse behind him was vast and immaculate, with polished floors that gleamed under soft lighting. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else, money, old money that had been sitting comfortably for generations. As Lawrence led him inside, Derek's eyes took in the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled out below, a glittering expanse that felt almost unreal. This was a different universe, one where people didn't worry about overdue bills or whether the groceries would last until payday. Derek had answered honestly. He wasn't a trained butler, but he was dependable, quick to learn, and knew what it meant to work hard. Lawrence seemed to weigh each word, his sharp eyes reading Derek in a way that made him feel like the man could see past the suit, past the Brooklyn accent, right into his intentions. At the end, Lawrence said simply, "I'll discuss this with my daughter. If we decide to hire you, you'll start immediately." That night, Derek returned home with a mix of hope and anxiety. He didn't tell Harold or Naomi the details, just that he might have found a better-paying job. He didn't want to raise their expectations until it was certain. 2 days later, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was firm, almost clipped. "Mr. Williams, this is Margaret Blake. My father tells me you might be the right fit for our household. If you're available, I'd like you to come tomorrow morning for a trial period." Derek agreed, the quick pace of her words leaving no room for hesitation. The next morning, dressed in the same suit but with a little more confidence, he returned to the Upper West Side. Margaret Blake met him in the grand foyer, her posture straight, her tailored gray dress as crisp as the tone in her voice. She was striking, tall, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair pulled into a sleek twist, but there was a coolness about her, a sense of distance that told Derek she wasn't someone who tolerated mistakes. She laid out his responsibilities in precise detail: maintain the household's cleanliness, manage deliveries, assist with meal service, and most importantly, care for her daughter Sophia when the nanny wasn't available. "You'll have a room on the service floor. Meals are included. In exchange, I expect absolute punctuality, discretion, and professionalism," Margaret said, her gaze never wavering. "If you cannot meet those standards, you won't last a week here." Derek nodded, keeping his expression neutral, but inside he felt the weight of her expectations. The penthouse was a world of quiet opulence, plush carpets that swallowed footsteps, walls adorned with oil paintings, the faint scent of fresh flowers in every room. His small assigned quarters on the service floor were modest but spotless, with a single bed, a narrow desk, and a window overlooking the alley behind the building. It was more than he had a home, and it came without the burden of rent. That first day was a whirlwind of introductions and tasks. The cook, Mrs. Keene, was a short, brisk woman who barely looked up from her chopping board when she told him where to store the groceries. The head housekeeper, Elena, had been with the family for decades and made it clear she ran the staff with her own set of rules. Derek quickly learned that in a household like this, hierarchy mattered, and respect had to be earned quietly. But the real challenge came when Margaret told him it was time to meet Sophia. The little girl was in a sunlit playroom, sitting in a small armchair by the window, her gaze fixed on the street below. She was tiny for her age, her legs tucked under a blanket, her dark curls falling softly around her face. Derek had expected her to look up when he entered, maybe smile or frown, but she didn't react at all. Margaret introduced him. "Sophia, this is Mr. Williams. He'll be helping around the house," but the girl didn't even blink. It was as if she were somewhere else entirely. Margaret's expression tightened before she turned to Derek. "She hasn't spoken or walked since her father passed away last year. The doctors say she can recover physically, but emotionally it will take time. Your role is to make her comfortable, but don't push her. Do you understand?" Derek nodded, glancing back at Sophia. There was something about her stillness that struck him. It wasn't the restless energy he'd seen in other children, but a deep, heavy quiet, like a door closed from the inside. Over the next week, Derek settled into the rhythm of the household. Mornings began early, often before sunrise, with coffee for Margaret and checking the day's deliveries. He kept the penthouse running smoothly, learning where everything belonged and how each family member preferred things done. When he was with Sophia, he mostly sat nearby, reading aloud from children's books or describing what he saw outside the window. She didn't respond, but he noticed tiny shifts, her eyes flicking toward him when she thought he wasn't looking, the faintest twitch of her lips when he made a joke under his breath. On his third full day, Derek experienced her leadership in action when a delivery arrived late. The florist had sent the wrong color roses for an evening dinner, and without a single trace of panic, Margaret made 2 calls and had the arrangement corrected within 20 minutes. Derek could tell she was used to having the world bend to her will. She was polite but distant with him, never offering more conversation than necessary, though he caught her watching him sometimes, as if measuring whether he truly belonged in her household. Lawrence Blake, on the other hand, was warmer in his own way. He appeared mostly in the evenings after Margaret had returned from her office, greeting Derek with a nod and sometimes asking about his day. He was old enough to have the air of someone who had seen several lifetimes of business and family politics, and Derek suspected that behind the polite demeanor was a man who missed the days when his role in the family was more central. He seemed genuinely fond of Sophia, and on the rare occasions Derek saw them together, Lawrence's entire posture softened. Sophia remained the greatest mystery. Derek's time with her was spent mostly in silence, but it wasn't the absence of noise that struck him, it was the depth of it, as though she lived in a world where no one else could reach her. She would sit in her favorite armchair by the window, sometimes holding a stuffed rabbit with worn ears, and watch the traffic far below. Derek made small attempts to engage her, talking about what he saw outside or showing her picture books. And though she never spoke, he noticed her eyes following his hands when he pointed at a page. It wasn't much, but it was something. That Friday evening, Margaret invited Derek to serve at a private dinner being hosted for a small circle of her business associates. It was his first time seeing her in full social command, and it was like watching a different person. Her smile was easy, her laughter well-timed, and she moved through the room as if it were a stage she had been born to command. Derek kept the glasses filled and the table cleared with quiet efficiency, absorbing snippets of conversation about mergers, charity events, and overseas properties. Most of the guests barely acknowledged him, but one man, a tall, silver-haired guest named Drayton, gave Derek a long, slow glance that made his skin prickle. Later, when Derek was in the kitchen rinsing glasses, Drayton appeared in the doorway. "You're new," he said, his voice smooth but edged. "Margaret hires carefully. You must be capable." Derek simply nodded, unsure how to respond, and Drayton gave a half-smile before disappearing back into the party. When the guests finally left, Margaret gave Derek a brief nod of approval, saying only, "You did well tonight," before retreating to her study. That simple sentence stayed with him longer than he expected. The next morning, Derek was in the playroom with Sophia when Lawrence came in carrying a tray of tea. "Thought you might want a break," Lawrence said, setting the tray down. He sat across from Derek, glancing at Sophia, who was curled up in her chair with the rabbit in her lap. "She used to run through this house," Lawrence said quietly, "from the kitchen to the balcony, laughing the whole way. Now, well, you see." Derek listened, sensing the weight of loss in the older man's voice. Lawrence sipped his tea, then added, "She needs someone patient, someone who won't give up when she doesn't answer." Derek nodded, understanding the message beneath the words. Over the next week, Derek tried different ways of reaching Sophia, showing her colorful origami shapes, humming quietly while he worked in the room, even telling her small stories about his sister Naomi's sketches. One afternoon, when the winter sunlight was pouring in through the window, he caught the smallest shift. Sophia glanced at him, just for a moment, before looking back at the street. It was fleeting, but it told him she was aware of him in a way she hadn't been before. Margaret remained a constant presence in the background, busy with work but always attuned to her daughter's state. Derek sometimes wondered if her distance was a shield, a way to keep her own emotions in check, because when she looked at Sophia, there was a softness that didn't exist in any other part of her life. The household itself seemed to move around the unspoken tension of a girl's silence. Even Elena, The head housekeeper was careful not to speak too loudly near Sophia, as if afraid of startling her. Derek began to feel a growing responsibility that went beyond his job description. Derek had followed those instructions to the letter, partly because he respected the rules, but partly because he didn't want to risk losing the job that now kept his family afloat. That day, Margaret left unexpectedly for an afternoon meeting, leaving Derek in charge of Sophia until Elena returned from errands. The winter light through the tall windows was muted, casting a pale glow over the playroom, which was filled with neatly arranged toys that looked as though they had been untouched for months. Sophia sat in her usual chair, holding her stuffed rabbit. Derek approached quietly, carrying a picture book he had found on one of the shelves. It was a simple story, bright colors, big illustrations, the kind of thing most kids could flip through and enjoy without much prompting. "You know," Derek said softly, lowering himself into the armchair across from her, "when I was little, my sister used to make me read to her every night. She'd pick the same book over and over until I could recite it, without even looking." Sophia's eyes flickered, but she didn't raise her head. He opened the book and began reading aloud, not expecting any response. His voice was low, steady, carrying the rhythm of the story without rushing it. He exaggerated certain parts just slightly, putting warmth into the characters' lines. He didn't look at her while he read, figuring it was better to let her feel unnoticed, if that was what she preferred. After a few minutes, he saw movement, barely a shift of her fingers, as she adjusted the rabbit in her lap. Her gaze had moved from the window to the open book. It was subtle, so small most people might have missed it, but Derek saw it. He kept reading, pretending he hadn't noticed. When he reached the end of the story, he closed the book gently. "That was one of my favorites," he said, as though speaking to the air. "My sister still keeps her old copy. The cover's all torn up now." Sophia didn't reply, but her head tilted just slightly, and Derek caught the quick glance she gave him before returning to the window. It was the smallest sign, but to Derek it felt like the first brick removed from a high wall. Over the next few days, he tried similar tactics. Sometimes he'd bring in another book, other times he'd just sit in the room and describe what he saw outside. The yellow taxi racing a city bus, the man walking 3 dogs at once, the woman in the red coat balancing 2 coffee cups as she crossed the street. On one occasion, he brought a small origami bird he had folded from scrap paper in his room. He set it on the table near her without saying a word. When he came back an hour later, it was gone from the table and sitting on the arm of her chair. Margaret noticed these changes too, though she didn't comment. Her gaze would linger a little longer on Sophia during the evenings, as though she was searching for something she hadn't seen in a long time. Derek suspected she wanted to ask about the books or the paper bird, but pride, or perhaps fear of false hope, kept her silent. Then, one cold Saturday morning, Lawrence stopped by the playroom while Derek was reading aloud. The older man stood in the doorway for a moment, watching quietly, before stepping in. "She used to love stories," he said, his voice almost wistful. Her father read to her every night before bed. They had this ridiculous routine. He'd change his voice for every character, and she'd giggle so loud you could hear it all the way in the kitchen. Sophia's fingers tightened around the rabbit, though her face didn't change. Derek glanced at her, then back at Lawrence. "Maybe she still likes them," Derek said. "She just hasn't found the right reason to show it yet." Lawrence nodded slowly, giving Derek a look that was part gratitude, part warning. Gratitude for the effort, warning not to push too hard. As the days passed, Derek's time with Sophia became a fixture in his routine. He learned that she preferred the mornings, when the sunlight made the playroom feel warmer, and that she didn't mind when he hummed softly while tidying up. He also learned that the rabbit, worn as it was always in her lap or within reach, and if it wasn't, she would look around with a flash of panic until it was returned to her. The more he observed, the more he felt the weight of her isolation. It wasn't just that she didn't talk or walk. It was as though she had sealed herself off entirely, retreating to a place where no one could hurt her again. Derek couldn't imagine what it would take to bring her back, but he found himself wanting to try, even if it took months. Late one night, as he lay in his small room on the service floor, Derek thought about how quickly this job had become more than just work. She was a woman accustomed to precision, to plans executed exactly as envisioned. And though she rarely raised her voice, the weight of her disapproval could crush a person as effectively as any shouted order. Derek learned this the hard way one Monday morning when he arrived in the dining room to find that the table had been set by Elena, but one of the coffee cups was slightly off-center. Margaret's gaze fell on it like a hawk spotting prey. "Mr. Williams," she said sharply, though he hadn't set the table. "In this house, presentation matters. If something looks wrong, you fix it before I see it." He didn't argue, simply adjusted the cup and made a mental note to check every detail before she entered a room. But small moments like that began to accumulate, and Derek realized Margaret's standards left no space for mistakes, real or perceived. With Sophia, the tension was even more delicate. Margaret wanted her daughter comfortable, but also seemed afraid of anything that might disrupt the girl's fragile equilibrium. One afternoon, Derek sat in the playroom reading to Sophia when he decided to try a simple game, rolling a small ball gently across the rug toward her chair. The ball stopped at her feet, and for a split second, Sophia's eyes flickered down to it. Before Derek could roll it again, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Just trying to engage her a little," Derek said carefully. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Her doctor says too much stimulation can overwhelm her. I don't want her pushed before she's ready." Derek nodded, but inside he bristled. He wasn't trying to overwhelm her. He had seen that tiny spark of curiosity in Sophia's eyes, and he wanted to build on it. But arguing with Margaret was pointless. Her word was final. That night in his small room, Derek thought about how much control she had over every aspect of Sophia's world, and how that control, while rooted in love, might also be a cage. Lawrence seemed to sense the same thing. A few days later, while Margaret was out, he stopped by the playroom and watched Derek read to Sophia. "You've got a good way with her," Lawrence said quietly. "Margaret means well, but she's protective to a fault." Derek hesitated before replying. "She loves her daughter. I get that. But maybe Sophia needs more than just safety." Lawrence's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing Derek's words. "Careful, son. Margaret doesn't take kindly to suggestions about her parenting. She's been through a lot." Derek understood the warning, but it didn't make him want to try any less. Still, the pressure of walking that line, between doing his job and not crossing Margaret's invisible boundaries, was exhausting. The smallest misstep could feel like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. The next clash came over something as simple as clothing. Derek had been helping Sophia choose a sweater before taking her to the terrace for some fresh air. She had looked at two options, one pale pink, the other deep blue, and to his quiet surprise, had reached for the blue. He helped her into it just as Margaret walked in. "Why isn't she wearing the pink one?" Margaret asked. "She chose the blue," Derek replied, thinking it was harmless. But Margaret's tone sharpened. "She's not making those decisions yet. The pink is softer. It doesn't draw too much attention." Derek bit back his instinct to argue and instead helped Sophia change, though he noticed the faint slump in her posture afterward. It felt wrong, undoing the only choice she'd made all day. Over time, the moments built up, Margaret stepping in to redirect him, questioning his decisions, correcting minor details in front of others. Derek kept his responses polite, but each time it happened, he felt the pressure mount, like he was walking on a floor that might crack beneath him. At the same time, there was a different kind of pressure, the responsibility he felt toward Sophia. Every tiny sign of progress, from her glancing at the books he read to the way her fingers sometimes brushed against the origami shapes he left for her, made him want to push just a little further. But with Margaret watching so closely, any push felt like a risk. Naomi noticed the change in his voice when he called home. "You sound tired," she said one night. Not just tired, worn out. Derek tried to laugh it off, but she wasn't wrong. It wasn't the work itself that drained him. It was the constant need to measure every move, to balance respect for Margaret's rules with his own growing conviction that Sophia needed more than what she was getting. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon when Sophia, without prompting, reached for a book on the low shelf near her chair. It was the first time Derek had seen her initiate anything. He sat beside her, heart pounding with quiet excitement, and began to read. She leaned slightly toward him, her eyes on the pictures. That was when Margaret entered. "I thought I said no more than 2 stories a day," she said, her voice tight. "She picked this one herself," Derek replied, keeping his tone even. Margaret hesitated, her eyes flicking to Sophia, then back to him. "It's not about what she picks. It's about keeping things structured." Derek had begun to accept that progress would be slow, measured in weeks or months. But then one gray afternoon in early February, everything changed in a way neither he nor Margaret could have predicted. It had been raining steadily since dawn, the kind of cold, relentless rain that turned the city into a wash of gray stone and dripping umbrellas. The sound of it against the tall windows filled the playroom, and Derek had been reading softly from a book about animals, while Sophia sat curled in her chair with a rabbit in her lap. He noticed she was watching the rain more than the pictures, her gaze fixed on the droplets racing each other down the glass. Without thinking, Derek set the book aside and said, "You know, this reminds me of a game my sister and I used to play when we were kids. We'd pick a raindrop and see if it could reach the bottom before the others." He pointed to one, tracing its path with his finger, narrating the little race. Sophia didn't move, but her eyes followed. It was a tiny thing, but it felt like a step forward. When the rain slowed a little, Derek decided to try something different. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small hand puppet he had bought a few days earlier from a street vendor, a bright green dinosaur with felt teeth and googly eyes. "This," he said in a conspiratorial tone, "is Dino. He's very polite, but very, very curious." He slipped it over his hand, making the puppet peek around the edge of the armchair before ducking back out of sight. He made the dinosaur's head tilt, looking at Sophia, then looking away, as if shy. "Dino wants to know if you like the rain," Derek said in a deep, playful voice. For the first time, Sophia's eyes shifted from the window to the puppet. It wasn't much, no smile, no sound, but it was direct. Encouraged, Derek made the puppet yawn dramatically, then sneeze, jerking back with a goofy achoo noise. That was when it happened, so small and quick that at first he thought he imagined it. Sophia's lips curved just slightly into a smile. Derek felt a rush of warmth in his chest, like sunlight breaking through clouds. He didn't react too strongly, afraid to startle her, but he kept the puppet going, making it trip over the edge of the chair and tumble onto the floor with an exaggerated groan. This time, there was no mistaking it. Sophia let out a small, breathy giggle, the sound barely audible, but enough to make Derek's throat tighten. He had never heard her make a sound that wasn't from movement or breathing. In that moment, the months of silence felt fragile, like ice beginning to crack under the first signs of spring. The sound must have carried, because when Derek looked up, he saw Margaret standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, shock, maybe, or something deeper, but she didn't say anything. She just watched. Derek kept the game going for another minute before letting the puppet fall asleep on the arm of the chair. Sophia's gaze lingered on it for a moment before she turned back to the window, but Derek could still see the faint trace of a smile on her face. Margaret stepped into the room, her eyes on Sophia. "It's time for lunch," she said softly, almost as if afraid to break the spell. As Derek left to help in the kitchen, he caught Margaret watching him, her gaze not cold this time, but cautious, as though she were re-evaluating something she thought she knew. That evening, Lawrence found Derek in the pantry putting away supplies. "I heard," he said simply, his voice carrying both surprise and hope. "You got her to laugh." Derek nodded, just for a second. Lawrence's mouth curved into a small smile. Sometimes a second is all it takes to start something bigger. Over the next few days, Derek noticed subtle changes. Sophia seemed to watch him more closely when he was in the room, and once, when he brought Dino back, her lips twitched as if fighting another smile. Margaret didn't comment on the puppet, but she didn't forbid it either, which for her was as good as approval. Derek could sense the shift, not just in Sophia, but in the atmosphere of the household. There was still the constant tension of Margaret's standards, but now there was also something else, something lighter, like the first faint breeze before spring. But just as Derek began to think the path forward might be smoother, an incident forced tensions to the surface and made every unspoken thought in the household spill into the open. It started on a Saturday afternoon when Margaret had invited a colleague over for coffee. The rain had cleared and pale sunlight streamed into the living room, giving the whole penthouse a softer glow. Sophia was in the playroom with Derek, and he decided to bring out Dino the puppet again, hoping to coax another smile. This time, Sophia reached for the puppet herself, her small hand brushing against his as she took it. The sight sent a quiet surge of pride through him. He let her hold Dino while he narrated a little story, making the puppet visit different parts of the room. It was light-hearted, harmless, or so he thought, until Margaret appeared suddenly in the doorway, her colleague a step behind. Sophia froze, her grip tightening on the puppet. Margaret's eyes darted from her daughter to Derek, her voice smooth but edged. "Sophia, sweetheart, why don't you put that down and say hello?" The girl's eyes dropped to her lap, her shoulders hunching inward. Derek felt the change in the air, that fragile openness collapsing back into silence. He set the puppet gently on the table, but the damage was done. Margaret's colleague smiled politely, clearly sensing the tension, and after a brief exchange, they moved on toward the kitchen. When Sophia had retreated completely into herself again, Derek stood in the empty playroom feeling an ache in his chest, not anger at Margaret exactly, but frustration at how easily one wrong move could undo days of progress. That evening, after Sophia was in bed, Derek went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Lawrence there, leaning on the counter with a glass of brandy. The older man studied him for a moment before saying, "You're thinking about earlier." Derek nodded. She was opening up, just a little. Then it was gone. Lawrence took a slow sip. Margaret's afraid. Every time she sees Sophia step toward the edge of that wall, she's terrified something will push her back into the dark for good. That fear makes her pull too soon. Derek's voice was low, but she is pulling her back herself. Lawrence's gaze held his. "I know." The next day, the unspoken tension between Derek and Margaret finally broke. She came into the playroom just as Derek was telling Sophia a simple story about a brave little bird learning to fly. Margaret stood by the window, listening, then said, "I appreciate your efforts, Mr. Williams, but you're not a therapist. You might think you're helping, but without the right guidance, you could be doing harm." Derek closed the book carefully and looked at her. "With respect, Mrs. Blake, I'm not trying to be a therapist. I'm just trying to be a person she can trust." Yesterday, she reached for the puppet herself. That's the most she's initiated since I met her. That's not harm. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, her tone sharpening. "You don't understand what it's like to watch your child break and have no idea how to fix her. Every moment I make a choice, I'm wondering if it will help her or destroy what's left of her." Derek's reply came without hesitation. "I don't understand your loss, but I understand what it's like to watch someone you love disappear in front of you. My father hasn't been himself in years, and my sister, she's young, but life's been beating on her since the day we buried our mother. If I only protected them from what could hurt them, they'd never grow. Sometimes they need a reason to try again." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Derek could see in her eyes the war between her instinct to control and the flicker of recognition at his words. Then Lawrence appeared in the doorway, his voice calm but firm. "He's right, Margaret." She turned toward her father, startled. "Dad." "No," he said, stepping into the room. "I've watched this for over a year. I've watched her sink deeper into that chair, and I've watched you keep the world at arm's length from her. You think you're protecting her, but you're building walls so high she'll never climb out." Margaret's hands tightened at her sides. "If I lose her completely, you've already lost parts of her," Lawrence said softly, "but you can help her find them again. And I think Derek can help too, if you'll let him." The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. Sophia sat in her chair, tracing the rabbit's ear with one finger, oblivious to the conversation shaping her future. Finally, Margaret exhaled slowly, her shoulders sinking just enough to show the first crack in her armor. "All right," she said, her voice low. "I'll give you more room to try. But if I see any sign she's overwhelmed, you'll step in," Derek finished. "Fair." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there wasn't a wall between them, just a wary truce. That evening, as Derek passed the study, he saw Margaret at her desk, not working, but sitting with her head in her hands. He didn't stop or say anything. This was a woman who valued privacy almost as much as control, but he understood that something had shifted. She hadn't let go of her fear, but she had loosened her grip on her daughter, and that was a start. In the days that followed, Derek noticed small but meaningful changes. Margaret still hovered at the edges sometimes, but she didn't interrupt as often. She even joined in once, sitting on the floor near Sophia as Derek read, her hand resting gently on her daughter's knee. Sophia didn't respond outwardly, but Derek saw her eyes flick toward her mother more than once, as if testing whether she could trust this new dynamic. One night, Lawrence stopped Derek in the hall. "She's not going to say it," he said, "but you did something today she didn't think she could do. You made her admit she was wrong." Derek shook his head. "I just told the truth." Lawrence smiled faintly. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to hear. As Derek settled into bed that night, he thought about the conversation in the playroom, about the way Margaret's voice had cracked when she spoke of losing Sophia. The walls around her were no longer impenetrable, though they still stood strong, like ancient stone weathered by time, but slowly crumbling at the edges. Derek's mornings were now a blend of routine care and careful observation. He would enter the playroom softly, mindful of Sophia's mood, often finding her curled up in her favorite chair with the worn rabbit clutched to her chest. He'd greet her quietly, sometimes with a soft hum or a whispered story, sometimes with nothing but a smile. Over time, she began to respond in small ways, lifting her eyes to follow his movements, offering the faintest tilt of her head, or allowing him to sit closer without flinching. These moments were precious and fragile, but they grew more frequent, and Derek cherished each one. One morning, as winter began to thaw and pale sunlight poured through the windows, Derek found Sophia not in her chair, but on the floor near the bookshelf, fingers tracing the spines of books. It was the first time he'd seen her move purposefully, without hesitation. He knelt beside her and gently pulled a colorful picture book from the shelf. "Look at this one," he said softly. "It's about a little girl who learns to paint with all the colors of the rainbow." Sophia didn't speak, but her fingers lingered on the pages as Derek read aloud. That day, Margaret appeared in the doorway, watching from a distance with a guarded expression. She stayed silent, but Derek caught the slight softening around her eyes. Encouraged, Derek tried introducing new activities, bringing puzzles, drawing materials, and soft music. Sophia's reactions were tentative but real. She began to tolerate and eventually seek his presence during these moments. There were times when she would reach out to touch the puppet Dino again, or allow Derek to help her with a coloring book. These small acts of engagement, once impossible, now became stepping stones toward recovery. Lawrence, too, noticed the changes. During one quiet afternoon tea, he told Derek, "I see a light coming back into her eyes, something I thought was gone forever." Derek nodded, humbled by the slow but undeniable progress. Still, the journey was far from over. Sophia's world remained shadowed by the loss of her father and the silence that had followed. There were days when she retreated completely, refusing to speak or move beyond her chair. Derek learned to recognize these moments not as setbacks, but as part of the process, a dance between fear and trust, retreat and advance. One afternoon, Margaret confided in Derek a glimpse of her own struggle. "It's like walking a tightrope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm terrified that if I let go, even for a moment, everything will fall apart." Derek listened without judgment. "Sometimes," he said gently, "holding on too tightly keeps us all stuck. Trusting takes more courage than controlling." Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the wall between them seemed thinner. Derek's growing bond with Sophia also began to influence Margaret's behavior. She started to ask more questions about the activities Derek planned, occasionally offering suggestions, and even allowed him to read to Sophia without interruption. The household atmosphere, once heavy with tension, carried a new undercurrent of cautious optimism. In those quiet, sunlit rooms, laughter became a rare but cherished visitor. One afternoon, as Derek and Margaret watched from the doorway, Sophia picked up a crayon and made a hesitant mark on the paper. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was a sign, a tangible step toward reclaiming the childhood stolen from her. Derek's heart swelled with quiet joy. The little victories, though small and sometimes fleeting, accumulated into a narrative of hope. He knew there would be challenges ahead, days of silence, frustration, and fear, but he also knew that each step Sophia took was a testament to resilience and love. In the evenings, Derek would call home to check in on Naomi and Harold, sharing with Naomi the progress Sophia was making. Naomi's voice, bright and encouraging, reminded him why he had fought so hard to be here, not just to care for a child, but to be part of healing a family fractured by loss. As spring approached, Derek reflected on how far Sophia had come. There's a center in Seattle, he explained one evening over dinner, where they combine music, movement, and animal therapy for children who've experienced trauma. It might be the fresh start she needs. Derek listened intently, the idea stirring something deep inside him, a blend of cautious optimism and the fear that this might be the last chance to truly reach Sophia. Margaret was hesitant at first. The thought of sending her daughter so far away was terrifying. "What if she doesn't come back?" she asked quietly, her voice breaking with the weight of that possibility. But as the days passed, Margaret's fear gave way to determination. She agreed that they needed to try everything, no matter how daunting. Preparations began swiftly. Derek helped pack Sophia's things, choosing soft blankets, favorite books, and the ever-present rabbit toy that had become her security blanket. Lawrence handled the logistics, arranging flights and accommodation near the therapy center. When the day came, the trio, Margaret, Derek, and Sophia, boarded the plane, their emotions a mix of hope, anxiety, and fragile excitement. The flight was long and quiet. Sophia clung tightly to Derek's hand for much of the journey, a silent acknowledgement of the trust they had built. Upon arrival, the therapy center was nestled in a serene forest outside Seattle, surrounded by towering pines and the crisp scent of pine needles. The buildings were bright and welcoming, with spaces designed to encourage movement and play. The staff greeted them warmly, explaining the multi-sensory approach that integrated music therapy, gentle physical exercises, and interaction with therapy animals, mostly golden retrievers trained to offer comfort and companionship. The first days were tentative. Sophia remained withdrawn, observing from a distance, clutching her rabbit with white-knuckled grip. But Derek and Margaret took turns sitting beside her, encouraging her without pressure, offering quiet reassurance. Slowly, the atmosphere began to soften. One morning, as the sun filtered through tall windows into the music room, Sophia allowed a golden retriever named Luna to nuzzle her hand. It was a moment so small yet so profound that Derek felt his breath catch. Encouraged, the therapist introduced simple movement exercises, rolling softballs, swinging gently, and listening to soothing guitar melodies. Each session chipped away at Sophia's shell. She started to lift her gaze more often, her fingers relaxed around the toys, and one afternoon, she even reached out to touch Derek's arm. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on the 10th day. Derek was sitting beside Sophia in the therapy room when she suddenly rose, wobbling but determined. His heart thundered as she took a few unsteady steps toward the doorway, looking back at him with wide, shining eyes. Then her voice, hoarse, trembling, but unmistakably clear, whispered, "Mommy." Tears sprang to Derek's eyes as Margaret rushed into the room, overwhelmed with joy and disbelief. Sophia repeated the word again, this time adding "Daddy," her voice gaining strength with each syllable. The penthouse miles away in New York seemed suddenly less cold, as if the distance had been bridged by that single moment of connection. The therapy continued, with Sophia growing stronger, her steps surer, and her words more frequent. Derek and Margaret took turns supporting her through each session, sharing smiles that spoke of shared victory and quiet relief. It wasn't just Sophia who was healing. Margaret was beginning to shed the armor of control she had worn for so long, learning to trust in the slow but steady power of love and patience. Derek felt a deep sense of purpose. What had started as a job to support his family had transformed into a mission to help a little girl reclaim her childhood and to mend a family fractured by grief. The flight back to New York was lighter than the trip to Seattle had been. Sophia clung to Derek's hand less tightly, her eyes bright with curiosity and a newfound confidence. Sophia was no longer the withdrawn, silent girl clutching her rabbit. She was becoming a child who could speak her needs, who could stand with steady legs and reach out for the world. The air inside the penthouse felt warmer, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the hope that followed Sophia's return from therapy. Margaret Blake, once rigid and guarded, began to shed the layers of control that had defined her for so long. She approached Derek one morning in the kitchen, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "Thank you," she said simply, words heavy with gratitude and relief. "For staying, for believing in her when I was afraid." Derek shrugged, smiling gently. "We all needed someone to believe. Sophia, Yumi, even Lawrence." The days that followed were filled with new rhythms. Breakfast became a family affair, with Margaret sitting alongside Derek and Sophia, laughing softly as Sophia asked for extra pancakes or recited her favorite stories. Lawrence returned from his frequent business trips with gifts, a new set of crayons for Sophia, a music box that played gentle melodies, and the household buzzed with activity and warmth that had once seemed impossible. Derek found himself more than a butler. He was a guardian of this fragile peace, a steady presence in a home that was learning to embrace imperfection and joy in equal measure. One spring afternoon, when the city air was fragrant with blooming flowers and the market stalls overflowed with lavender, Margaret invited Derek and Sophia to join her for a picnic in a quiet park just outside the city. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on their small gathering. Sophia chased butterflies, her laughter ringing clear, while Margaret and Derek shared a quiet conversation about the future. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. She took Derek's hand, her eyes bright with emotion. "You brought light back into this family," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "You taught me what courage, love, and faith truly mean. Derek, will you marry me? Be Sophia's father and build our home with me?" Derek's breath caught. Words failed him at first, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling and the promise held within that simple question. Tears welled in his eyes as he nodded, the three of them coming together in an embrace that spoke of new beginnings and unbreakable bonds. Their life from that day forward was marked by the kind of ordinary happiness that carries extraordinary meaning. The messy breakfasts, the weekend trips, the quiet evenings filled with stories and music. Sophia grew stronger and more confident, her footsteps echoing in the halls as she raced from room to room, and Derek and Margaret found a partnership grounded in trust, respect, and shared hope. More than a fairy tale ending, their story was a testament to the power of perseverance and the healing found in connection. It was a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness, a single spark, a laugh, a touch, a moment of trust could light the way back. Derek often thought back to the cold, gray days in Brooklyn, the long nights when he had felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He realized that those struggles had prepared him for this journey, not just the journey of helping Sophia, but the journey of learning to open his heart and family to others. The Blake penthouse, once a velvet tomb of grief and silence, had become a home where hope thrived and love endured. And in that transformation lay the true miracle, the end. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing so you won't miss any future chapters. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot resonated most with you? Are you watching from home, on the go, or somewhere else? Share your experiences and questions in the comments below. Your feedback helps shape the stories we tell.